The knife blade caught the fluorescent light as it sliced through the onion with surgical precision. Emma Collins moved through the prep kitchen of the Golden Anchor with the fluid grace of someone who had mastered the art of being unremarkable. Her calloused hands worked steadily, dicing vegetables for the evening rush, while the sounds of the busy restaurant filtered through the service window. To anyone watching, she was just another kitchen worker, invisible in her stained apron and worn sneakers, earning minimum wage in a world that had forgotten she existed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But secrets have a way of surfacing when you least expect them, and sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one nobody bothers to notice. Emma had perfected the art of disappearing in plain sight. At 28, she moved through her days like morning mist over Riverside Valley's harbor, present but unnoticed, capable but deliberately unremarkable. Her studio apartment above Tony Marcelli's Italian deli reflected this philosophy of invisibility. Clean but sparse, functional but forgettable. No trophies lined the shelves, no photographs decorated the walls. Nothing that might invite questions about the woman she used to be before the world decided she was too dangerous to remain visible. The Golden Anchor had become her sanctuary over the past 3 years. The upscale seafood restaurant overlooking the marina provided the perfect environment for someone who preferred shadows to spotlights. Owner chef Marcus Webb had hired her. Without probing too deeply into her background, perhaps recognizing a kindred spirit who valued competence over conversation, she spent her shifts prepping vegetables and cleaning equipment for weekend warriors of the culinary world, chefs who talked endlessly about technique and presentation, blissfully unaware that the quiet woman washing their dishes could have taught them lessons about precision they'd never imagine. The kitchen brigade treated her with the casual indifference reserved for support staff. She was Emma from prep, reliable but invisible, someone who showed up on time and did her work without complaint or conversation. They had no idea that her knife skills came from training that went far beyond culinary school, that her steady hands had once been featured on pay-per-view broadcasts, watched by millions of screaming fans. "Emma, you sure you don't want to join? US for drinks after service?" asked Lisa Chun, one of the line cooks who'd made several attempts at friendship over the months. "There's this new place down by the wharf that has amazing craft cocktails." Emma looked up from the mountain of carrots she was julienning, her movements never pausing in their mechanical rhythm. "Thanks, but I'm good here. Early morning tomorrow." Lisa shrugged with the resigned acceptance of someone who'd grown accustomed to Emma's polite deflections. The other kitchen staff had long since stopped trying to draw her into their social circles. She was friendly enough during work hours, helpful when asked, but she maintained boundaries that nobody seemed able to cross. They'd created their own theories about her reluctance to socialize. Maybe she was shy. Maybe she had family obligations. Maybe she just preferred her own company. None of them guessed that Emma Collins was hiding from a past that had once made her one of the most feared competitors in professional mixed martial arts. The lunch rush had ended, and the kitchen had settled into the afternoon lull that preceded dinner preparation. Emma found herself alone in the prep area, her hands working through muscle memory as she broke down chickens for the evening special. The repetitive motions were meditative, allowing her mind to wander while her fingers performed tasks that required no conscious thought. She'd learned long ago that being underestimated was often an advantage. In her former life, opponents who looked at her 5'6" frame and assumed she was just another pretty face in the cage had paid dearly for that miscalculation. Now, coworkers who saw only a quiet prep cook had no idea they were working alongside someone who had once held 3 championship belts simultaneously. The service bell chimed, and Jake Patterson pushed through the kitchen doors with his characteristic grin. Jake worked as a server at the Golden Anchor, but his real passion was amateur boxing at the Pine Ridge Community Center. He was one of The few staff members who'd managed to pierce through Emma's careful defenses, not through persistence but through genuine respect for her obvious desire for privacy. "Still hiding behind that cutting board, Collins," Jake said, but his tone held warmth rather than judgment. "When's the last time you actually threw a punch instead of just dicing vegetables?" "Last Tuesday," Emma replied without looking up. "Helped you move that new heavy bag into the community center. That doesn't count, and you know it." Jake leaned against the stainless steel counter, his expression growing more serious. "Look, I'm heading over to Pacific Coast MMA Academy tomorrow night. They've got an open training session for women. You should come with me." Emma's knife stilled for just a moment before resuming its precise work. "I don't think that's a good idea." "Come on. When's the last time you were around people who actually understand what real training looks like? These restaurant folks are nice enough, but they think a workout means walking to their cars after a double shift. You need to be around athletes." Again, the phrase "athletes again" hit Emma harder than Jake probably intended. She'd once been part of something so exclusive, so demanding, that most people couldn't even imagine the level of dedication required. The professional fighting circuit had been a world where physical perfection met mental toughness, where split-second decisions determined whether you went home with a victory bonus or a stretcher ride to the emergency room. Now she was just another service worker trying to blend into civilian life, carrying skills that felt increasingly useless with each passing day of chopping vegetables and scrubbing pans. "I'm fine here," she said, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Jake studied her face with the persistence of someone trained to read body language from his boxing experience. "Emma, I've seen what happens when fighters try to disappear completely. It doesn't end well. You need this, even if you won't admit it." After he left, Emma found herself staring at her reflection in the blade of her knife. She looked ordinary, forgettable, exactly what she'd worked to achieve for 3 years. But Jake's words lingered like smoke from a grease fire, reminding her of who she used to be before the world decided she was too dangerous to remain in the spotlight. That evening, she stood in her small bathroom, rolling up her sleeves as she washed her face. The faded scar on her left shoulder caught the light, a souvenir from her final professional fight. Most people would assume it was from some mundane accident, a kitchen burn, or a childhood mishap. They had no idea it marked the spot where a dislocated shoulder had been relocated in the middle of a championship bout, or that she'd continued fighting for 2 more rounds before submitting her opponent with a rear-naked choke. Emma had earned her reputation through trials that broke 80% of aspiring fighters before they reached the amateur level. She'd competed in venues that seated 20,000 screaming fans, made split-second tactical adjustments that turned certain defeat into spectacular victory. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She'd been part of something larger than herself, something that mattered to people who understood the difference between sport and spectacle. Then politics had intervened, and champions became liabilities overnight. A single incident, blown out of proportion by media hungry for controversy, had transformed her from rising star to persona non grata. The athletic commissions that had once courted her suspended her license. The sponsors who had funded her training camps disappeared. The teammates who had shared her victories suddenly found reasons to train elsewhere. The next morning, Jake called at exactly 7 a.m. "I'm picking you up at 6 tonight. Wear something you can move in. We're going training." Emma started to protest, but something in his tone suggested this wasn't really a request. She'd grown to trust Jake's judgment. Over their months of friendship, he was one of the few people at the restaurant who'd never pushed her to reveal more than she was comfortable sharing, who seemed to understand that some people carried histories they preferred to keep private. An hour later, she found herself agreeing to the visit with a mixture of anticipation and dread churning in her stomach. "Just so you know," Jake said as they made plans, There might be some serious competitors there tomorrow night. Try not to show them up too badly. Emma almost smiled. If only he knew that showing up was the last thing on her mind. All she wanted was to observe from the sidelines without drawing attention to herself, to maybe remember what it felt like to be around people who understood the difference between fitness and fighting. She had no idea that within 24 hours, her carefully constructed invisibility would shatter like glass under pressure, exposing truths that some people preferred to keep buried. As she finished her prep work that afternoon, Emma felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came from contemplating a return to her former world. The perfectly maintained equipment, the sound of gloves hitting heavy bags, the sight of young fighters moving with the purposeful intensity she once knew intimately. It all reminded her of what she'd lost and could never reclaim. "You okay?" Lisa asked, noticing her distant expression. "I'm fine," Emma lied, rolling down her sleeves to make sure the scars stayed hidden. Some secrets were better left undiscovered, and some legends were safer when they remained invisible. The Golden. Anchor's main dining room buzzed with the controlled chaos of Friday evening service. Emma worked in her usual spot at the prep station, methodically preparing garnishes for the dinner plates that would soon flow from the kitchen to tables, filled with Riverside Valley's affluent residents and weekend tourists. The restaurants. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a spectacular view of the marina, where expensive yachts bobbed gently in their slips under the setting sun. She wore her standard uniform, black pants, white cotton shirt under a stained apron, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. To anyone watching, she looked like exactly what she was supposed to be, a hard-working prep cook with no ambitions beyond her next paycheck. The kind of person who existed in the background of other people's stories, essential but unremarkable. "Look at this crowd," Marcus Webb said, surveying the packed dining room from the kitchen's pass-through window. "Corporate party season always brings out the big spenders. And the big egos." Emma nodded without looking up from her work, but she could see the crowd he meant. Tables full of men in expensive suits and women in designer dresses, their voices carrying the particular confidence of people accustomed to having their opinions heard and their demands met without question. She'd learned to recognize the type during her fighting career. Wealthy patrons who attended matches not because they appreciated the sport, but because they enjoyed the spectacle of watching others compete while they observed from expensive seats. They were the same people who would cheer loudest when fighters got hurt, who treated athletes like gladiators existing for their entertainment. "Hey, check out table 12, Jake said, returning from the dining room with a tray of empty glasses. "Some real pieces of work out there tonight. Investment bankers celebrating some big merger deal. Already complaining about everything from the wine selection to the temperature of the bread." Emma glanced through the service window and saw the table in question. 6 people in their 30s and 40s, their body language radiating the aggressive confidence of individuals who'd never been told no without significant financial compensation. The kind of crowd that treated service staff like props in their personal drama rather than human beings deserving basic respect. She'd encountered similar groups throughout her years in restaurants. People who seemed to view rudeness as a privilege that came with wealth, who measured their own importance by their ability to make others uncomfortable. In her fighting days, she'd occasionally been forced to attend corporate events and sponsor parties filled with exactly these types. Back then, her reputation had provided a buffer. People might be condescending to a waitress, but they were considerably more polite to someone who could break their arm in 3 different ways. Now, without that protection, she was just another service worker to be ignored or dismissed at their convenience. "Table 12 is asking for extra attention tonight," Marcus announced to the kitchen staff. "Big spenders, but demanding. Keep the food perfect and the service smooth. Last thing we need is wealthy customers posting negative reviews online." Emma continued her work, unconsciously cataloging the dynamic she observed through the window. The table's apparent leader was a heavy-set man with thinning hair and the soft look of someone who'd never done physical labor. His voice carried over the restaurant's ambient noise whenever he laughed, which seemed to happen primarily when he was making comments at other people's expense. The group included two women who appeared to be colleagues rather than romantic partners, their designer clothing and expensive jewelry suggesting successful careers in finance or law. They participated in the conversation with the calculated enthusiasm of people networking rather than socializing. Emma recognized the performance. She'd done similar networking herself during her fighting career, smiling and laughing at sponsors. Jokes while internally counting the minutes until she could escape. Someone should tell the kitchen help to stay in the kitchen where they belong. The heavy-set man's voice carried clearly across the dining room, followed by laughter from his companions. I don't come to places like this to look at the help. Emma's hands stilled momentarily before resuming their work. She'd heard variations of that comment throughout her service industry career. The casual cruelty of people who viewed restaurant workers as slightly more sophisticated than furniture, existing solely to facilitate their dining experience without drawing attention to themselves as individual human beings. Lisa noticed her expression. Don't let jerks like that get to you. Their money spends the same as everyone else's, but it doesn't make them better people. Emma nodded, appreciating the support while internally noting how much restraint was required to ignore such casual disrespect. In her former life, people who spoke dismissively about others rarely did so twice after meeting her. Not because she'd threatened them, but because her reputation preceded her in ways that encouraged more thoughtful behavior. The evening progressed with typical Friday night intensity. Orders flowed from the dining room to the kitchen in steady waves, keeping the entire staff focused on their respective responsibilities. Emma found herself settling into the familiar rhythm of high-volume food preparation, her hands working with mechanical precision while her mind remained alert to the dynamics playing out beyond the kitchen doors. Emma, Marcus called out around 9 p.m. I need you to take these appetizer plates to table 12. Lisa's swamped with the seafood orders. It was an unusual request. Emma typically remained in the prep area throughout her shifts, her interaction with customers limited to the occasional glimpse through the service window. But the restaurant was understaffed tonight, and everyone was stepping up to fill gaps wherever necessary. She wiped her hands, removed her apron, and picked up the tray of artfully arranged appetizers. The walk from kitchen to dining room felt longer than usual, her awareness heightened by the prospect of direct interaction with the demanding corporate group Jake had warned her about. Table 12 occupied a prime spot near the windows, their conversation animated by wine and the kind of aggressive camaraderie that develops when successful people compete to impress each other with increasingly outrageous stories and opinions. Here are your appetizers, Emma said quietly, beginning to distribute plates around the table with efficient, unobtrusive movements. Finally, the heavy-set man said without looking at her. I was beginning to think you people had forgotten how to do your jobs. Emma continued serving without response, her expression neutral and professional. She'd learned long ago that engaging with difficult customers rarely improved situations and often made them significantly worse. Brad, be nice, one of the women said with a laugh that suggested she didn't actually expect him to modify his behavior. The help is doing their best. Brad Kingston, apparently, was the group's unofficial leader and primary source of entertainment through increasingly inappropriate comments. Emma completed her service and began to turn away when his voice stopped her. Hey waitress, he called, his tone carrying the casual authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. This bread is cold. Go back to the kitchen and get some that's actually warm. Emma turned back, noting that the bread in question appeared perfectly acceptable, still steaming slightly from the restaurant's warming ovens. But customer service protocols were clear about accommodating reasonable requests, even when they seemed unnecessary. "Of course," she said simply. "I'll bring fresh bread right away." As she reached for the basket, Brad's next comment changed. "Everything. And make sure you actually know what you're doing this time. Maybe stick to what you're good at and go back to the kitchen where you belong." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Emma felt something shift inside her chest, a familiar sensation she hadn't experienced in 3 years. Not anger exactly, but a recognition of the moment when patience transforms into something more dangerous. She looked at Brad Kingston directly for the first time, really seeing him. Soft around the middle, manicured hands that had never thrown a punch or taken one. The kind of smug confidence that came from a lifetime of never facing consequences for casual cruelty. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice carrying a new quality that made the nearby conversations pause. "What did you say?" Brad seemed delighted by her response, interpreting it as an invitation to escalate rather than a warning to reconsider. "I said go back to the kitchen where you belong. That's what you people do, right? Cook and clean and try not to get in the way of your betters?" The restaurant's ambient noise seemed to fade as Emma set down the breadbasket with deliberate care. Every person within hearing distance had gone quiet, sensing that something significant was about to happen without understanding exactly what. Emma Collins had spent 3 years learning to be invisible, to absorb insults and dismissal. Without response, to let people underestimate her while she chopped vegetables and washed dishes in comfortable anonymity. But some lines, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. And some people, when pushed far enough, remembered exactly who they used to be. The silence that followed Brad Kingston's words stretched across the dining room like a held breath. Emma stood, perfectly still beside table 12, her posture unchanged, her expression calm. But something in the quality of her stillness made nearby diners unconsciously lean back in their chairs. It was the kind of quiet that preceded storms, the moment when atmospheric pressure drops and animals seek shelter without understanding why. Jake Patterson had been clearing glasses from a neighboring table when he heard Brad's comment. He knew Emma well enough to recognize the subtle shift in her body language, the way her shoulders squared almost imperceptibly, the slight tilt of her head that meant she was calculating rather than simply listening. He'd seen similar changes in fighters at the community center, the moment when sparring partners realized they were no longer engaged in playful competition, but something more serious. "Emma," Jake said quietly, moving closer with the casual ease of someone trying to diffuse tension before it escalated. "Why don't you let me handle table 12? You can get back to prep." But Emma didn't acknowledge his presence. Her focus remained entirely on Brad Kingston, who seemed oblivious to the shift in atmosphere around him. The other members of his party had grown quiet, some primitive instinct warning them that their companion had crossed an invisible line, though none of them could articulate what exactly had changed. "Did you hear me, sweetheart?" Brad continued, his voice carrying the patronizing tone of someone who'd never learned that volume and authority weren't the same thing. "I asked you to go back where you belong. Kitchen work is about all someone like you is qualified for anyway." The restaurant's other patrons had begun to notice the confrontation, conversations trailing off at nearby tables as people turned to observe what appeared to be a routine service dispute. Most assumed they were witnessing nothing more dramatic than an entitled customer berating a service worker, the kind of unfortunate interaction that occasionally marred expensive dining experiences. They had no idea they were about to witness something that would become local legend. Emma's response came in a voice so quiet that people strained to hear it, yet it carried clearly across the suddenly hushed dining room. "Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," Brad laughed, looking around the table at his companions as if sharing a private joke. "Pretty simple situation. You're the help, I'm the customer. You do what I tell you to do. That was when Marcus Webb appeared from the kitchen, drawn by reports from his staff that there was trouble developing at one of the prime tables. As owner and head chef, he'd dealt with difficult customers throughout his career, but something about this particular confrontation felt different. Maybe it was the way other diners had gone silent, or the rigid tension in Emma's normally relaxed posture. "Is everything all right out here?" Marcus asked, positioning himself where he could see both Emma and the corporate table. "Everything's fine," Brad replied before Emma could speak. "Just trying to get your kitchen staff to understand their place. This one seems confused about which side of the serving window she belongs on." Marcus had hired Emma 3 years ago specifically because she never caused problems. She was reliable, competent, and got along well with both kitchen staff and the occasional customer interaction. In all that time, he'd never seen her involved in any kind of confrontation or dispute. If there was trouble now, he was certain it hadn't originated from her behavior. "Emma is one of my most valuable employees," Marcus said carefully, his tone professional but firm. "I'm sure we can resolve whatever the issue is." "The issue," Brad said, his voice rising slightly as he realized he was being challenged rather than automatically supported, "is that your people need to learn some respect for paying customers. We're spending serious money here, and we deserve service that reflects that investment." Emma finally spoke again, her voice maintaining that same unnaturally calm quality. "What kind of service would reflect your investment, Mr. Kingston?" The use of his name seemed to surprise Brad. He hadn't introduced himself to the kitchen staff, and her knowing it suggested she'd been paying more attention to his table than he'd realized. For the first time since the conversation began, he looked at her directly rather than simply in her general direction. What he saw should have given him pause. Emma Collins wasn't looking at him with the deference or intimidation he'd expected from service staff. Her gaze was steady, evaluating. The look of someone taking measurements rather than receiving instructions. Her hands hung loosely at her sides, but there was something about her stance that reminded him uncomfortably of athletes he'd seen on television, fighters preparing to engage. But Brad Kingston had spent his entire adult life in environments where money translated directly to power, where his ability to hire and fire created automatic deference from anyone he considered subordinate. He mistook Emma's stillness for submission and her calm for defeat. "Service that acknowledges is important here," he said, emboldened by what he interpreted as her retreat. "Service that keeps the help in their proper place instead of letting them think they can talk back to their betters." The word betters seemed to resonate through the dining room like a bell struck too hard. Conversations at other tables stopped entirely as diners realized they were witnessing something beyond a simple service dispute. This had become a confrontation about dignity, respect, and the assumptions people made about each other based on occupation and appearance. Jake moved closer to Emma, recognizing signs he'd seen in fighters who were about to do something that couldn't be undone. "Emma, why don't you take a break? Get some air outside while Marcus handles this." But Emma shook her head slightly, never breaking eye contact with Brad. "It's fine, Jake. Mr. Kingston was just explaining his philosophy about proper places and knowing your betters. I'd like to hear more about that." There was something in her tone that made Jake's blood run cold. He'd heard similar inflections from boxers who'd decided they were finished with defensive tactics and ready to demonstrate why their opponents should have been more careful about provocation. Brad, however, seemed to interpret her response as invitation to continue his lecture. "Exactly. Everyone has their place in the world, sweetheart. Some people are born to lead, others are born to serve. Smart people figure out which category they belong in and act accordingly." "And you believe you're in the leadership category?" Emma asked, her head tilting slightly to one side in what looked like genuine curiosity. "Obviously. Look around. You, expensive restaurant, expensive clothes, expensive car in the parking lot. Success speaks for itself. Meanwhile, You're wearing an apron and taking orders from people like me." Emma nodded slowly, as if considering his logic. "That's an interesting perspective. So you judge people's worth based on their current job rather than their actual capabilities?" "Current job usually reflects actual capabilities," Brad replied with the confidence of someone who'd never been forced to reconsider his assumptions. "People end up where they deserve to be." The conversation had drawn attention from across the restaurant. Even diners at distant tables had begun to notice the unusual tension. The way staff members had begun to gather at the edges of the dining room, as if anticipating something significant. Marcus found himself wishing he'd diffused the situation earlier, but now it seemed to have developed its own momentum. "Mr. Kingston," Emma said, her voice still carrying that unnaturally calm quality, "what if I told you that your assumptions about people might not be as accurate as you think? I'd say you're not qualified to judge my assumptions about anything." Brad laughed, looking around the table at his companions for support. What would a kitchen worker know about real success or leadership? That was the moment when Emma Collins made a decision that would change everything for everyone in the restaurant. She reached up and began untying her apron, her movements deliberate and unhurried, like someone removing costume pieces after a long performance. "You're right that people often end up in positions different from where they started," she said, folding the apron carefully and setting it on an empty chair. "Sometimes circumstances require adaptation." Brad watched her actions with growing irritation. In his experience, service workers who began acting independently were service workers who needed to be reminded of their place more forcefully. "What are you doing? I didn't give you permission to stop working." Emma turned back to face him, and something in her expression had shifted. The deferential mask she'd worn throughout their interaction had begun to dissolve, revealing something harder underneath. "Mr. Kingston, do you follow mixed martial arts at all?" The question seemed to come from nowhere, and Brad looked genuinely confused. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Just curious about your interests." "Do you remember a fighter named Emma the Silencer Collins? She held 3 championship belts simultaneously about 4 years ago, before she disappeared from competition." Brad shrugged impatiently. "Never heard of her. I don't waste time watching people beat each other up for money. Now stop changing the subject and get back to work." Emma smiled for the first time since the conversation had begun, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the smile of someone who just confirmed everything they needed to know about their opponent's preparation and awareness level. "That's unfortunate," she said quietly, "because if you had heard of her, you might have made different choices about how to speak to people tonight." Jake felt his stomach drop as pieces began falling into place. Emma's reluctance to discuss her past, her obvious physical fitness despite working in food service, her familiarity with combat sports terminology during their conversations about his boxing training. He'd suspected she had some athletic background, but this revelation was far beyond anything he'd imagined. Marcus, standing close enough to hear the exchange, found himself staring at his quiet prep cook with entirely new eyes. Emma Collins had worked in his kitchen for 3 years, without ever suggesting she had experience beyond basic food service. She'd been professional, reliable, and completely unremarkable. The idea that she might be a former professional fighter seemed impossible, except that it explained certain things about her that he'd never questioned before. Her knife skills were extraordinary, far beyond what most cooks developed even after years of experience. She moved through the kitchen with an economy of motion that suggested deep familiarity with physical space and positioning. When equipment malfunctioned or emergencies arose, she responded with a calmness that went beyond simple competence into something approaching tactical thinking. "Emma," Marcus said quietly, "maybe we should discuss this in my office." But Emma shook her head, her attention remaining focused on Brad Kingston, who was beginning to look less amused and more annoyed by the conversation's direction. "No, Marcus. Mr. Kingston wanted to have a discussion about proper places and knowing your betters. I think we should finish that conversation. Look, sweetheart, Brad said, his voice taking on an edge of genuine irritation. I don't know what game you think you're playing, but I'm done with it. Either get back to work or get out of my sight. And if you think making up stories about being some kind of fighter is going to impress anyone, you're even dumber than you look. The insult hung in the air like a challenge thrown down in an arena. Emma's smile widened slightly, but her eyes had gone completely cold. Around the dining room, people who'd been pretending not to watch the confrontation gave up any pretense of ignoring what was happening. This had moved beyond uncomfortable customer interaction into something that felt genuinely dangerous. Mr. Kingston, Emma said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I've spent 3 years learning to ignore comments like that. 3 years practicing patience with people who think money gives them the right to treat others like property. 3 years remembering that some fights aren't worth winning. Brad leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone who believed he'd established dominance through superior aggression. Finally, some common sense. Now go get me that fresh bread and remember your place next time. Emma nodded slowly, as if accepting his instruction. She turned toward the kitchen, took 2 steps, then stopped and looked back over her shoulder. The thing is, Mr. Kingston, I just realized something important. Some fights are worth winning after all. That was when everything changed. Emma turned around with fluid precision, her movement so smooth it looked almost choreographed. She walked back toward table 12 with the purposeful stride of someone who'd made a decision that couldn't be unmade. The other diners in the restaurant seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, conversations dying completely as attention focused on the developing confrontation. Brad Kingston sat in his chair with the smug satisfaction of someone who believed he'd successfully established his authority over a subordinate. His companions looked less certain, primitive instincts warning them that something had shifted in ways their conscious minds couldn't quite process. The woman approaching their table no longer moved like service staff. There was something predatory in her gait, something that suggested she was no longer interested in avoiding conflict. Did you need something else? Brad asked, his tone carrying dismissive irritation. I thought we established that you have work to do. Emma stopped beside his chair, close enough that he had to crane his neck to look up at her. From this angle, he could see details about her physical condition that hadn't been apparent when she was standing across the table. Her forearms, visible now that she'd rolled up her sleeves, showed the kind of muscle definition that came from serious athletic training. Her hands, which he'd assumed were soft from kitchen work, actually showed the calloused knuckles and scarred fingers of someone familiar with impact and resistance. Mr. Kingston, she said, her voice still carrying that unnaturally calm quality, I want to give you one opportunity to reconsider your approach to this conversation. Brad laughed, but the sound had less confidence than before. Reconsider? What? You're a kitchen worker having some kind of breakdown. Security should probably escort you out before you make this worse for yourself. Michael Torres, the restaurant's part-time security guard, had been monitoring the situation from across the dining room. He was a retired police officer who'd taken the job primarily for the steady income and the opportunity to stay active in his 60s. In his experience, most restaurant disturbances involve either intoxicated customers or minor disputes over service quality. This felt different. There was something about the way the woman was positioned, the controlled tension in her posture, that reminded him of situations from his law enforcement career, when things were about to escalate beyond verbal confrontation. Ma'am, Michael called out, approaching their table with the careful steps of someone trying to diffuse potential violence. Maybe we should step outside and talk about whatever the problem is. Emma didn't turn toward the security guard, keeping her attention focused entirely on Brad. The problem, Officer Torres, is that Mr. Kingston seems to believe that treating people with disrespect is acceptable behavior as long as you can afford expensive meals. The fact that she knew Michael's name surprised him. In 3 years of occasional interactions, she'd never displayed detailed knowledge about restaurant staff she didn't work with directly. But her use of his former title was even more telling. Most people called him Mike or Security. Only someone with law enforcement or military background tended to use formal titles automatically. "Emma," Jake said, moving closer but staying far. Enough away to avoid seeming threatening. "Whatever you're thinking about doing, this isn't the way to handle it." "Handle what?" Brad demanded, looking around the table at his increasingly nervous companions. "What exactly does everyone think is going to happen here? She's a kitchen worker having some kind of mental breakdown. Call the police and have her removed." Emma finally turned slightly, acknowledging Jake's presence without taking her primary focus off Brad. "Jake, do you remember asking me about my background? About why I never wanted to talk about what I did before working at the restaurant?" Jake nodded slowly, beginning to understand that he was about to get answers to questions he'd been asking for months. "Yeah, I remember. The truth is, I used to solve problems like Mr. Kingston professionally. People who thought their money or position gave them the right to treat others badly. The athletic commissions used to pay me quite well for it, actually." Brad's expression shifted from annoyance to something approaching concern. The woman standing beside his table was speaking, with the calm confidence of someone who'd moved beyond empty threats into statements of fact. Her posture hadn't changed, but there was something different about the way she held herself, as if she'd stopped pretending to be someone she wasn't. "You're talking crazy," he said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier authority. "Security, get her away from our table." Michael Torres found himself in an increasingly difficult position. His training told him to separate potential combatants before situations escalated to physical confrontation. But his experience also warned him that this particular woman wasn't displaying the erratic behavior of someone having an emotional breakdown. She was too controlled, too focused. He'd seen similar demeanor from undercover officers revealing their true identity to suspects who'd pushed situations too far. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I need you to step back from the table and explain what's going on here." Emma nodded respectfully toward the security guard. "Officer Torres, what's going on is that Mr. Kingston has spent the evening treating restaurant staff like servants who exist solely for his entertainment. He's made multiple comments about people knowing their proper place and staying where they belong. I've decided to show him what happens when someone's proper place isn't what he assumed." Brad started to stand up from his chair, perhaps intending to assert physical presence in a situation where his verbal authority had proved insufficient. It was the wrong decision at exactly the wrong moment. Emma's hand moved with liquid speed, settling on his shoulder with just enough pressure to keep him seated. To casual observers, it looked like a gentle gesture, someone steadying a customer who'd risen too quickly. But Brad felt the strength in that grip, the suggestion of force held carefully in check. "Please stay seated, Mr. Kingston," Emma said quietly. "We're not finished with our conversation about proper places." That was when Detective Rachel Barnes entered the restaurant. Detective Barnes had been ending her shift when dispatch reported a potential disturbance at the Golden Anchor. Normally, restaurant disputes were handled by patrol officers, but the establishment's location in Riverside Valley's upscale marina district meant that any problems there could involve prominent citizens who required careful handling. She'd decided to check on the situation personally, expecting to find nothing more serious than an intoxicated customer or a minor billing dispute. What she found instead was a dining room full of silent, tense patrons focused on a confrontation between a well-dressed businessman and a restaurant worker who was standing far too close to his table for comfort. The atmosphere felt charged. Like the moments before thunderstorms when animals seek shelter and experienced people start securing loose objects. "Riverside Police," she announced, her voice carrying the automatic authority of law enforcement. "I'm Detective Barnes. Is there a problem here?" Brad Kingston felt a surge of relief at the arrival of official intervention. In his world, police were allies who protected property and maintained order that benefited people like him. He was certain that Detective Barnes would quickly identify the real problem and remove the unstable restaurant worker from the situation. "Officer, thank God," he said, his voice carrying the tone of an innocent victim reporting a crime. "This woman has been harassing our table all evening. She's clearly having some kind of breakdown and won't leave us alone. I want her arrested for disturbing the peace." Detective Barnes looked from Brad to Emma, taking in details that most civilians would miss. The woman's posture was controlled but ready, like someone prepared for action but not seeking it. Her positioning relative to the seated man suggested tactical thinking rather than emotional reaction. Most telling was her calm demeanor despite being accused of criminal behavior by someone demanding her arrest. "Ma'am," Detective Barnes said to Emma, "could you please step back from the table and explain your version of what's happening here?" Emma nodded respectfully and took 2 steps backward, her hands visible and non-threatening. "Detective Barnes, my name is Emma Collins. I work in the kitchen here. Mr. Kingston has spent the evening making increasingly disrespectful comments about restaurant staff, culminating in telling me to go back to the kitchen where I belong and referring to people like me as beneath. People like him. That's not illegal," Detective Barnes replied, though her tone suggested she didn't approve of such behavior. "Rudeness isn't a crime, even when it's directed at service workers." "You're absolutely right," Emma agreed. "Which is why I haven't broken any laws. I've simply been trying to have a conversation with Mr. Kingston about his assumptions regarding people's capabilities based on their current employment." Brad laughed harshly. "Conversation? You've been standing over me making threats and talking nonsense about being some kind of fighter. This is harassment, and I want her charged." Detective Barnes studied Emma more carefully, noting details that were beginning to suggest a more complex situation than the simple disturbance report had indicated. The woman's physical condition was excellent, far beyond what most food service workers maintained. Her speech patterns were educated and precise. Most significantly, she was showing no signs of the emotional agitation that typically accompanied public confrontations. "Ms. Collins," Detective Barnes said, "Mr. Kingston mentioned something about you claiming to be a fighter. Could you clarify that statement?" Emma smiled slightly, the expression carrying a mixture of amusement and something that might have been anticipation. "Detective, have you ever heard of Emma the Silencer Collins? She was a professional mixed martial arts fighter who held multiple championship belts before disappearing from competition about 4 years ago." The name struck Detective Barnes like physical impact. She'd been a casual fan of MMA during her college years and remembered Emma Collins quite well. The Silencer had been known for ending fights quickly and decisively, usually via submission holds that left her opponents unconscious before they realized they were in serious trouble. Her career had ended abruptly amid some kind of controversy, but Barnes couldn't remember the specific details. "You're claiming to be Emma Collins?" Detective Barnes asked, her voice carrying a new note of caution. "I'm not claiming anything," Emma replied calmly. "I am Emma Collins, and Mr. Kingston has spent the evening lecturing me about knowing my proper place and understanding my position relative to people he considers my betters." The revelation sent a shock wave through the dining room. Patrons who'd been following the confrontation suddenly found themselves looking at the situation with entirely different understanding. They weren't witnessing a dispute between a customer and service worker. They were watching a former professional fighter being systematically insulted by someone who had no idea what kind of person he was dealing with. Brad Kingston, however, remained skeptical. Even if that's true, which I doubt, what does it matter? She's working in a kitchen now, which means whatever she used to be doesn't matter anymore. Success is about what you're doing now, not what you used to do. Detective Barnes found herself in an increasingly delicate situation. If Emma Collins was who she claimed to be, then Brad Kingston had been unknowingly provoking someone with the skills and experience to seriously injure him without breaking a sweat. Professional fighters, even retired ones, were required to register their status with local law enforcement in many jurisdictions, specifically to prevent situations like this. Ms. Collins, Detective Barnes said carefully, assuming you are who you say you are, I need you to understand that your background creates certain legal obligations. Professional fighters can face enhanced charges for assault due to their training. Emma nodded seriously. I'm well aware of those statutes, Detective. Which is why I've spent 3 years learning to walk away from confrontations instead of engaging with them. Unfortunately, Mr. Kingston seems determined to push this situation beyond the point where walking away is an option. What's that supposed to mean? Brad demanded, finally beginning to sense that the dynamic around him had shifted in ways he didn't understand. Are you threatening me? Emma turned back to face him directly, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she allowed her professional persona to show through her civilian disguise. Her stance changed subtly, weight shifting to the balls of her feet, shoulders squaring in a way that suggested readiness for action. The transformation was remarkable to witness, like watching someone remove a mask to reveal their true face. Underneath, Mr. Kingston, she said, her voice carrying a new quality of absolute certainty, I've given you multiple opportunities to reconsider your approach to this conversation. You've chosen to double down on disrespect and contempt for people you consider beneath you. That's unfortunate, because you're about to learn a very expensive lesson about making assumptions. That was when Brad Kingston made his final, fatal mistake. Brad Kingston stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the polished hardwood floor, with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed dining room. His face had flushed red with a combination of alcohol, embarrassment, and mounting anger at being challenged by someone he considered far beneath his social station. The revelation about Emma's alleged fighting background had only served to irritate him further rather than provide the warning it was intended to be. I've heard enough of this nonsense, he declared, his voice carrying across the restaurant with the authority of someone accustomed to having his pronouncements accepted without question. I don't care if you think you're some kind of tough girl, or former whatever you claim to be. Right now, you're nothing but kitchen help who's forgotten her place, and I'm going to make sure you remember it. The threat hung in the air like a physical presence, causing nearby diners to push back from their tables instinctively. Even those who had no experience with violence could sense that something was about to happen that would be impossible to undo. The atmosphere in the Golden Anchor had transformed from elegant dining to something that felt dangerously unpredictable. Emma remained perfectly still, watching Brad's aggressive posturing with the clinical detachment of someone evaluating a problem that required solution. Her years of professional fighting had taught her to read opponents' intentions through their body language, to identify the moment when words would give way to action. Brad Kingston was displaying all the classic signs of someone who had decided that physical intimidation was necessary to restore his damaged authority. Mr. Kingston, Detective Barnes interjected, her voice carrying the sharp edge of law enforcement authority. I need you to sit back down and lower your voice. This situation doesn't need to escalate any further. But Brad was beyond listening to reasonable instruction. The combination of expensive wine, wounded ego, and complete ignorance of what he was actually dealing with had pushed him past the point where rational thought could influence his decisions. He took a step toward Emma, his hands clenched into fists that had never struck anything more dangerous than a golf ball. Don't tell me what to do, He snapped at the detective without taking his eyes off Emma. "I'm the victim here. This woman has been harassing me and my guests all evening, and now she's making up ridiculous stories to try to intimidate us. I've had enough of being threatened by the help." Emma's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, like someone adjusting focus to see a distant object more clearly. The mask of civilian anonymity she'd worn for 3 years was dissolving completely, revealing something harder and infinitely more dangerous underneath. She was no longer Emma, the prep cook who cleaned vegetables and avoided confrontation. She was becoming someone who had earned the nickname the Silencer by ending fights before her opponents realized they had begun. "Sir," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, yet somehow carrying clearly to every corner of the dining room, "I want to give you one final opportunity to reconsider your approach to this situation." Jake Patterson had been watching the escalation with growing horror, recognizing that his friend was transforming into someone he'd never seen before. The Emma he knew was quiet, thoughtful, someone who went out of her way to avoid conflict. The woman standing beside table 12 was someone else entirely, someone who radiated the kind of controlled danger that made experienced fighters cross to the other side of training gyms. "Emma," he called out, his voice tight with concern, "please don't do anything that can't be undone." She turned slightly to acknowledge him, and Jake felt his blood freeze at what he saw in her eyes. There was no anger there, no emotional heat. That might be reasoned with or cooled down. Instead, there was the cold calculation of someone who had decided that diplomacy had run its course and more direct action was required. "Jake," she said calmly, "some people can only learn through experience. Mr. Kingston has made it clear that words aren't sufficient to modify his behavior." Marcus Webb had been standing near the kitchen entrance, torn between his responsibility to protect his employee and his obligation to prevent his restaurant from becoming the site of a violent incident. The Golden Anchor had built its reputation on providing elegant dining experiences for Riverside Valley's affluent residents. Whatever happened in the next few minutes could destroy decades of careful business development. "Everyone needs to calm down," he said, stepping forward with his hands raised in a gesture of peaceful mediation. "This is a misunderstanding that's gotten out of hand. Emma, why don't you take the rest of the evening off? Mr. Kingston, your dinner is on the house. Let's all just step back and let cooler heads prevail." But Brad Kingston was beyond the reach of reasonable compromise. The suggestion that he was somehow equal to blame in the confrontation only inflamed his sense of injustice. In his world, problems were solved by asserting dominance over subordinates, by making it clear who held power and who was expected to submit to that power. "I'm not stepping back from anything," he declared, taking another step toward Emma. "This woman is going to learn some respect for her betters, and everyone else in this place is going to see what happens when the help forgets their place." That was the moment when Emma Collins made her decision. The transformation was remarkable to witness. One moment she was standing in a neutral position, hands at her sides, posture relaxed. The next moment she had shifted into a combat stance, so smoothly that observers might have thought they'd imagined the change. Her weight moved to the balls of her feet. Her hands came up in a guard position that looked casual but provided optimal defensive coverage, and her entire demeanor shifted from civilian to professional fighter. "Mr. Kingston," she said, her voice now carrying the flat, emotionless tone of someone who had moved beyond warnings into statements of fact. "You've been given multiple opportunities to walk away from this situation. You've chosen to escalate instead. That's unfortunate. For you." Brad looked at her stance and laughed, the sound harsh and mocking in the silent dining room. "Oh, look at that. Kitchen help thinks she knows how to fight. This should be entertaining." Detective Barnes realized that she was about to witness something that would require extensive paperwork and potentially create legal complications that would extend far beyond a simple disturbance call. Professional fighters who engaged in altercations with civilians faced enhanced legal scrutiny, But the circumstances of this particular confrontation were complex enough that determining fault would require careful investigation. "Miss Collins," she said urgently, "I need you to step back immediately. Regardless of what Mr. Kingston has said, physical violence is not an appropriate response." Emma nodded slightly without taking her eyes off Brad. "Detective, I understand your position. However, Mr. Kingston appears to have decided that this situation requires a physical resolution. I'm simply preparing to accommodate his preference." Brad's face twisted with rage at what he perceived as continued mockery from someone he considered far beneath him socially and economically. The idea that a kitchen worker would dare to speak to him in such terms, particularly in front of witnesses that included his business associates, was intolerable. He had built his entire identity around the assumption that wealth and social position provided automatic authority over people in service industries. "You want to accommodate my preferences?" he snarled, moving closer until he was within arm's reach of Emma. "Here's what I prefer. I prefer that you get on your knees and apologize for wasting my time with your ridiculous fantasy stories. Then I prefer that you crawl back to your kitchen and remember that you're nothing but hired help." The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke, visible to everyone present, even Brad's dinner companions who had remained silent throughout. Most of the confrontation shifted uncomfortably at the crude nature of his demands. The request for a woman to get on her knees in front of a room full of strangers crossed lines that went beyond simple rudeness into something approaching public humiliation. Emma's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture. That made experienced observers take unconscious steps backward. It was the same kind of subtle adjustment that predatory animals made when they transitioned from surveillance to action, a barely perceptible redistribution of energy that preceded explosive movement. "Mr. Kingston," she said quietly, "that was a mistake." What happened next occurred so quickly that most witnesses would later struggle to describe the sequence of events accurately. Brad had raised his right hand, perhaps intending to point at Emma or make some other gesture of dominance. Emma moved with the liquid speed of someone whose reflexes had been honed through thousands of hours of professional training. Her left hand deflected his arm effortlessly, while her right hand struck his wrist with surgical precision, targeting the exact pressure point that would cause his entire arm to go numb instantly. The technique was so subtle that observers might have thought she'd simply brushed his hand aside, but Brad's shocked expression revealed that something much more significant had occurred. "What did you do?" he gasped, staring at his hand in confusion as feeling began to disappear from his fingers. "Demonstrated that your assumptions about my capabilities were incorrect," Emma replied calmly. "That was a very gentle introduction to what real training looks like, Mr. Kingston. I suggest you use this opportunity to reconsider your position." But Brad Kingston had spent his entire adult life in environments where backing down from confrontation was perceived as weakness. That invited further challenge. Despite the evidence that he was dealing with someone far more dangerous than he'd realized, his pride wouldn't allow him to admit error or retreat from the position he'd taken. "You think that parlor trick impresses anyone?" he said, shaking his arm to restore circulation. "I'm still standing, and you're still nothing but kitchen help who's about to learn a very expensive lesson." He lunged forward awkwardly, his movement telegraphed and clumsy compared to Emma's fluid precision. What he intended as an intimidating grab became the opening that sealed his fate. Emma had been hoping he would back down, that the demonstration of her capabilities would be sufficient to end a confrontation without serious injury. His decision to escalate to actual physical contact eliminated her options for merciful resolution. Her response was textbook professional technique applied with devastating efficiency. She sidestepped his clumsy approach while simultaneously catching his extended arm, using his own momentum against him in a classic Aikido redirect. As he stumbled past her, off balance and vulnerable, She applied a joint lock that was so precisely executed it looked almost gentle to untrained observers. The sound that followed was unmistakable to anyone who had ever heard bones breaking. Under pressure. Brad's scream echoed through the dining room as Emma's technique found its target with surgical accuracy, applying leverage to his knee joint that exceeded the structural limits of cartilage and ligament. The entire sequence, from his initial lunge to his collapse on the restaurant floor, took less than 3 seconds. Professional fighters and martial artists who might have been watching would have recognized it as a masterful display of technique, precision, and controlled application of force. To civilian observers, it looked like magic or luck, too quick and smooth to be fully comprehended by people unfamiliar with combat sports. Brad Kingston lay on the polished hardwood floor of the cook of the Golden Anchor, clutching his shattered knee and screaming in pain that was both physical and psychological. The arrogant businessman who had spent the evening lecturing others about proper places and knowing their betters had been reduced to helpless agony by someone he had consistently dismissed as beneath his notice. Emma stood over him with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout their confrontation, showing no signs of exertion or emotional reaction to what had just occurred. To her, this had been a simple problem that required a straightforward solution. Brad Kingston had insisted on learning through experience rather than instruction, and she had provided that experience with the efficiency that had once made her a champion. The dining room had erupted in chaos. Patrons were pushing back from their tables, some standing to get better views of the unprecedented violence, others moving toward exits in case the situation escalated further. Cell phones appeared throughout the restaurant as people began recording video and calling emergency services, ensuring that what had just occurred would be documented and disseminated far beyond the immediate witnesses. Detective Barnes was already on her radio, calling for emergency medical services and additional units to secure what had suddenly become a crime scene. Her initial assessment of a simple restaurant disturbance had proven catastrophically inadequate for the situation that had actually developed. This is Detective Barnes requesting immediate ambulance response to the Golden Anchor Restaurant, Harbor Point Marina. We have one individual with serious leg injury requiring emergency transport. Also requesting backup units for crowd control and investigation support. Emma remained standing beside Brad's writhing form, making no attempt to flee or avoid responsibility for what had occurred. Her hands hung loosely at her sides, and her breathing remained completely normal, as if she had just completed a routine training exercise, rather than permanently disabled someone in front of dozens of witnesses. "Miss Collins," Detective Barnes called out, her weapon drawn but not aimed. "I need you to step away from Mr. Kingston and put your hands where I can see them." Emma complied immediately, moving several steps away from Brad before raising her hands to shoulder height with palms visible. "Detective, I'm not resisting arrest or attempting to flee. Mr. Kingston insisted on physical confrontation despite multiple warnings about the likely consequences. I responded with appropriate defensive measures." The term appropriate defensive measures would later become a point of significant legal debate. Professional fighters were held to different standards when it came to self-defense claims, expected to use minimal force necessary to neutralize threats rather than demonstrating the full extent of their capabilities. Emma's technique had been precisely targeted to disable without killing, but the permanent nature of Brad's injury would complicate any legal arguments about proportionality. Michael Torres, the restaurant security guard, approached Emma with the careful movements of someone who had witnessed her capabilities and had no desire to test them personally. "Ma'am, I need you to turn around and place your hands behind your back." Emma complied without resistance, allowing herself to be handcuffed while maintaining the same calm demeanor she had displayed throughout the confrontation. As the restraints closed around her wrists, she looked down at Brad Kingston, who was still screaming and clutching his destroyed knee. "Mr. Kingston," she said quietly, her voice somehow carrying over his cries of pain. "I hope this experience has provided you with some valuable insights about making assumptions regarding people's capabilities based on their current employment." The paramedics arrived within minutes, their professional assessment confirming what Emma had known from the moment she applied the joint lock. Brad's knee was comprehensively destroyed, requiring immediate surgical intervention and likely permanent disability. The precision of the injury suggested someone with intimate knowledge of human anatomy and the exact amount of force required to cause specific types of damage. As Brad was loaded onto a stretcher, still conscious and still screaming, he managed to focus his attention on Emma long enough to gasp out a threat. "You're going to prison for this. I'll make sure you never work anywhere again. You're finished." Emma watched his departure with the same expression she might have worn while observing any other routine event. "Mr. Kingston, you spent the evening telling me to go back to the kitchen where I belong. I think you'll find that prison is actually a significant improvement over kitchen work in terms of job security and benefits." The comment drew shocked laughter from several witnesses, people responding to the surreal juxtaposition of her calm humor and the violence that had just occurred. Even Detective Barnes found herself suppressing a smile at the observation, though she quickly restored her professional composure. As Emma was led toward the police car that would transport her to Riverside Valley Police Department for processing, Jake Patterson managed to get close enough to speak with her privately. "Emma, what the hell just happened here?" he asked, his voice tight with confusion and concern. 3 years I've known you, and I never saw anything like this. How did you do that to him?" Emma paused in her movement toward the patrol car, turning to face her friend with an expression that mixed sadness and resignation. "Jake, I tried to warn him multiple times. Some people can only learn through experience, and Mr. Kingston insisted on the most expensive possible education. But his knee, Emma, you destroyed his knee. That's not self-defense, that's professional-level violence." Emma nodded seriously. "You're absolutely right. It was professional-level violence applied to someone who wouldn't accept any other form of instruction. I spent 3 years learning to walk away from situations like this, Jake. Tonight, walking away stopped being an option." As the police car pulled away from the Golden Anchor, Emma Collins found herself looking back at the restaurant that had been her sanctuary for 3 years. She had known this moment would come eventually, that her past would catch up with her carefully constructed civilian life. She had hoped it would happen on her terms rather than being forced by someone else's arrogance and cruelty. The irony wasn't lost on her that Brad Kingston had gotten exactly what he'd asked for. He had demanded that she go back to the kitchen, where she belonged, assuming that such a place represented limitation and subservience. What he hadn't realized was that Emma Collins had never belonged in kitchens or restaurants or any other civilian occupation. She belonged in arenas where conflicts were resolved through skill, preparation, and the disciplined application of force. She belonged in a world where respect was earned rather than demanded, where capabilities mattered more than bank accounts or social connections. Tonight, for the first time in 3 years, she had returned to where she truly belonged. The consequences of that return would unfold over the coming days and weeks, but Emma felt a sense of completeness that had been missing from her life since she'd been forced into hiding. Some people were born to serve others, as Brad Kingston had insisted throughout their confrontation. But some people were born to teach lessons to those who needed them most, regardless of how expensive those lessons might prove to be. The Golden Anchor restaurant remained closed for the rest of the evening as investigators processed the scene and interviewed the dozens of witnesses who had observed the confrontation. The story would spread throughout Riverside Valley within hours, growing in the telling until Emma Collins became a local legend, the quiet kitchen worker who had taught a wealthy businessman the most expensive lesson of his life. But that was still to come. For now, Emma sat in the back of a police car, handcuffed but strangely at peace. watching the marina lights reflect off the dark water as she was transported toward an uncertain future that finally felt more honest than the careful lies she had been living for 3 years. Marcus Webb stood in his empty restaurant, surveying the damage to his business reputation and wondering how he would explain to insurance investigators that one of his employees had just ended a customer's mobility with techniques that most people only saw in professional fighting venues. The Golden Anchor had built its success on providing elegant dining experiences for Riverside Valley's elite clientele. Now it would be remembered as the place where a prep cook had demonstrated the difference between actual toughness and the kind of borrowed authority that came with expensive clothing and luxury automobiles. The reputation damage would be significant, but Marcus found himself oddly proud of Emma Collins for refusing to accept treatment that no human being should have to tolerate. Some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. Brad Kingston had chosen to cross every line available to him, and Emma had responded with the kind of precision that left no room for misunderstanding about who had actually been in control of the situation from the very beginning. The legend of the Silencer had returned to active duty, whether the world was ready for her or not. As Detective Barnes completed her preliminary scene investigation, she reflected on the unusual nature of the case that had just landed on her desk. Assault charges against professional fighters were typically straightforward, with clear distinctions between victim and perpetrator. This situation defied easy categorization, involving a retired champion who had been subjected to systematic verbal abuse before being physically threatened by someone who had no understanding of the danger he was creating. The legal proceedings would be complex, potentially setting precedents about self-defense rights for individuals with specialized combat training. Emma Collins had clearly used excessive force relative to the threat posed by an untrained civilian. But the provocation had been extensive and the physical confrontation had been initiated by the alleged victim. Defense attorneys would argue that Brad Kingston had received exactly the education he had demanded, delivered by someone uniquely qualified to provide it. Prosecutors would counter that professional fighters had obligations to avoid violence. Regardless of provocation, that specialized training created enhanced responsibility for restraint. The case would likely generate significant media attention, particularly given the dramatic nature of the confrontation and the socio-economic dynamics involved. A wealthy businessman humiliated and permanently disabled by someone he had dismissed. As mere service staff would provide irresistible material for journalists and commentators looking to explore themes of class conflict and social justice. But those considerations were beyond Detective Barnes' immediate responsibilities. Her job was to document what had occurred, collect evidence, and present a clear narrative for prosecutors to evaluate. The legal and social implications would be determined by others in courtrooms and conference rooms far removed from the restaurant floor, where Brad Kingston had learned the most expensive lesson of his privileged life. The witnesses who had observed Emma's transformation from invisible kitchen worker to devastating fighter would remember the experience for the rest of their lives. They had seen something that challenged fundamental assumptions about power, authority, and the wisdom of judging people based on their apparent social position. Most importantly, they had witnessed what happened when someone pushed a genuine warrior past the point where patience and restraint were possible options. The lesson had been delivered with surgical precision, but its implications would resonate far beyond the specific individuals involved in the confrontation. Emma Collins had reminded everyone present that legends don't always announce themselves with fanfare or obvious credentials. Sometimes they reveal themselves only when circumstances require the application of skills that most people prefer to believe exist only in movies and sporting events. The kitchen where Emma had spent 3 years hiding in plain sight would remain empty tomorrow, her carefully maintained anonymity shattered as completely as Brad Kingston's knee. But the story of what had occurred would live on, passed down through Riverside Valley's social networks as a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating people based on their current circumstances. Some lessons could only be learned through direct experience, regardless of how much that experience might cost. Brad Kingston had insisted on the most thorough possible education, and Emma Collins had provided it with the professionalism that had once made her a champion. The bill for that education would be paid in medical expenses, legal fees, and permanent disability, but the knowledge gained would last a lifetime. Whether that knowledge proved worth the price would be a judgment that only Brad Kingston could make, assuming he ever regained enough perspective to understand what had actually happened to him on the night he told a legend to go back to the kitchen where she belonged. The Riverside Valley Police Department's interrogation room was exactly what Emma Collins had expected: sterile, uncomfortable, and designed to encourage confessions through psychological pressure rather than physical force. She sat in a metal chair across from Detective Barnes, her handcuffs removed, but her hands resting calmly on the scratched table surface. For the first time in 3 years, she felt completely honest about who she was and what she was capable of accomplishing. "Ms. Collins," Detective Barnes began, activating the digital recorder that would document their conversation for legal proceedings. "You're being charged with aggravated assault, causing serious bodily harm. Before we proceed, I need to inform you of your rights and give you an opportunity to contact legal representation." Emma listened to the familiar Miranda warning with the attention of someone who understood that every word would be scrutinized by attorneys and judges in the coming months. When Detective Barnes finished, Emma nodded slowly and made a decision that would surprise everyone involved in the case. "Detective, I waive my right to remain silent and my right to legal representation. At this time, I want to provide a complete statement about what occurred at the Golden Anchor this evening." Detective Barnes raised an eyebrow, her experience suggesting that suspects with Emma's background and the severity of charges she faced typically demanded immediate legal counsel before answering any questions. Professional fighters who found themselves in legal trouble usually had attorneys who specialized in defending athletes against assault allegations. "Ms. Collins, I need to make sure you understand the implications of that decision. You're facing serious charges that could result in significant prison time. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court proceedings." Emma smiled slightly, an expression that held no humor but considerable resolve. "Detective, I've spent 3 years hiding from who I am and what I've accomplished. Tonight, for the first time since my discharge from professional fighting, I acted like the person I was trained to be. I'm not interested in hiding behind legal technicalities or claim that I was somehow a victim in that situation." The statement would later prove pivotal in court proceedings, establishing Emma's mental state and her acceptance of responsibility for the actions that had resulted in Brad Kingston's permanent disability. Defense attorneys typically advised clients to admit nothing and challenge everything, but Emma Collins had spent 3 years living a lie and was finally ready to embrace complete honesty about her capabilities and choices. "All right," Detective Barnes said, settling back in her chair with the satisfaction of an investigator who sensed she was about to receive unusually candid testimony. "Tell me what happened at the Golden Anchor, starting from the beginning of your interaction with Mr. Kingston." Emma's account was methodical, detailed, and completely consistent with the testimony that would later be provided by the dozens of witnesses who had observed the confrontation. She described Brad's escalating verbal abuse, her multiple attempts to defuse the situation, and the moment when she had decided that educational intervention was necessary to modify his behavior. "Detective, I want to be completely clear about something important. When I applied that joint lock to Mr. Kingston's knee, I knew exactly what the outcome would be. I have extensive knowledge of human anatomy and the precise application of leverage required to cause specific types of damage. His injury was not accidental or the result of excessive force during a struggle. It was a calculated response designed to provide him with an educational experience he would never forget. The admission was startling in its honesty and completeness. Most suspects attempted to minimize their actions or claim that injuries occurred accidentally during legitimate self-defense. Emma was acknowledging premeditation and precise intent to cause permanent harm, eliminating potential defense strategies based on heat of passion or accidental escalation. Ms. Collins, you're essentially confessing to deliberately injuring Mr. Kingston in a way that you knew would cause permanent disability. Why are you providing testimony that will almost certainly result in your conviction? Emma considered the question seriously before responding. Because it's the truth, Detective. I spent my professional career being honest about my capabilities and intentions. When I fought in legitimate venues, everyone involved understood exactly what I was capable of doing and chose to participate anyway. Mr. Kingston insisted on a confrontation without understanding what he was requesting. I'm simply being honest about what I provided. The interrogation continued for several hours, with Emma providing detailed explanations of her martial arts background, her reasons for retiring from professional competition, and her decision to work in restaurant kitchens while maintaining her fighting skills through private training. Her answers painted a picture of someone who had voluntarily withdrawn from public life, but had never stopped being exactly what she had always been. A professional fighter capable of ending conflicts with decisive, permanent solutions. One final question, Ms. Collins. Do you regret what happened tonight? Emma paused, considering her response carefully. I regret that Mr. Kingston chose to escalate the situation to the point where educational intervention became necessary. I regret that he was unwilling to learn through verbal instruction and required more direct methods. But I don't regret teaching him a lesson that he clearly needed to learn about treating other human beings with basic respect and dignity. 3 weeks after the incident at the Golden Anchor, Emma found herself in a courtroom filled with media, representatives, legal observers, and curious citizens who had come to witness the trial of the woman who had become known throughout Riverside Valley as the Kitchen Fighter. The case had attracted regional and national attention, generating debate about self-defense rights, class conflict, and the responsibilities of individuals with specialized combat training. Brad Kingston sat in a wheelchair at the prosecutor's table, his shattered knee encased in a complex brace that would be a permanent reminder of his encounter with Emma Collins. His legal team had assembled an impressive collection of medical experts, character witnesses, and legal precedents designed to portray him as an innocent victim of unprovoked violence by someone whose training made her a deadly weapon disguised as a harmless service worker. Emma's court-appointed attorney, David Chun, had initially attempted to convince her to pursue a strategy based on self-defense and temporary insanity brought on by prolonged workplace harassment. Emma had rejected those approaches, insisting on a defense that acknowledged her capabilities while arguing that her actions had been proportionate to the systematic disrespect and eventual physical threat posed by Brad Kingston. Your Honor, Prosecutor Jennifer Walsh began in her opening statement. The defendant Emma Collins is a trained professional fighter who deliberately and with premeditation caused permanent disability to an unarmed civilian during what should have been a routine customer service interaction. Mr. Kingston may have been rude or demanding, but those behaviors do not justify the level of violence that was inflicted upon him by someone whose martial arts training makes her hands and feet deadly weapons. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the argument that Emma's background created enhanced responsibility for restraint, that professional fighters forfeit certain self-defense protections in exchange for their specialized capabilities. They presented medical testimony about the precise nature of Brad's injury, arguing that such surgical destruction of joint integrity could only result from deliberate application of techniques designed to cause maximum damage. Emma's defense attorney faced the challenge of acknowledging his client's capabilities while arguing that her response had been appropriate given the circumstances that led to physical confrontation. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," David Chun said during his opening statement, "My client Emma Collins is indeed a trained fighter who possesses skills that most of us can barely imagine. But she is also a human being who was subjected to systematic verbal abuse, social humiliation, and eventual physical threat by someone who believed his wealth gave him the right to treat other people like property." The defense strategy focused on the escalation pattern that had preceded the physical confrontation, arguing that Brad Kingston had created the conditions that made violence inevitable through his deliberate refusal to accept reasonable boundaries. They presented testimony from restaurant staff and patrons who had witnessed the verbal abuse, establishing a pattern of behavior that went far beyond normal customer complaints into territory that constituted harassment and intimidation. Emma's decision to testify on her own behalf proved to be the pivotal moment in the trial. Most defendants with her background would have been advised to remain silent, allowing their attorneys to present their case without risking damaging cross-examination. Emma insisted on speaking for herself, determined to provide the jury with a complete understanding of her motivations and decision-making process. "Ms. Collins," her attorney began, "please tell the court about your background in martial arts and professional fighting." Emma's testimony was comprehensive and honest, covering her rise through amateur competition to professional championships, her decision to retire following political controversy, and her subsequent efforts to build a civilian life away from the fighting world. She described the discipline and control required for professional competition, the extensive training in both technique and restraint that defined legitimate martial arts instruction. "I learned that true martial artists avoid violence whenever possible," she explained to the jury, "not because we're afraid of confrontation, but because we understand exactly what the consequences of our actions will be. For 3 years, I successfully avoided situations that might require me to use my training. Unfortunately, Mr. Kingston's behavior made avoidance impossible." The prosecution's cross-examination was aggressive but ultimately unsuccessful in quofa, undermining Emma's credibility or portraying her as someone who had been seeking an opportunity for violence. Prosecutor Walsh attempted to suggest that Emma had deliberately provoked the confrontation by revealing her fighting background, but Emma's responses were calm and consistent. "Ms. Collins, isn't it true that you could have simply walked away from the situation instead of engaging with Mr. Kingston's comments?" Emma nodded thoughtfully. "That's absolutely correct. Ms. Walsh, I could have returned to the kitchen and allowed Mr. Kingston to continue treating restaurant staff as his personal entertainment. However, someone needed to teach him that such behavior has consequences, and I was uniquely qualified to provide that education." The admission that she had chosen confrontation over avoidance reinforced the prosecution's argument about premeditation, but it also demonstrated Emma's complete honesty about her motivations and decision-making process. The jury was faced with a defendant who readily admitted to deliberately injuring someone, while arguing that such action had been necessary and appropriate. Brad Kingston's testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution's case, describing the permanent impact of his injury on his professional and personal life. He portrayed himself as the victim of an unprovoked attack by someone whose hidden capabilities made her a danger to innocent civilians throughout the community. "I was just having dinner with business associates," he testified, his voice tight with residual pain and obvious anger. "This woman attacked me without warning, using techniques that no normal person would even know existed. I'll never walk normally again because she decided to play out some kind of violent fantasy." But Brad's testimony proved problematic under cross-examination, as Emma's attorney systematically revealed the pattern of verbal abuse and social intimidation that had preceded the physical confrontation. Security footage from the restaurants cameras captured most of his comments, and witness testimony corroborated the escalating nature of his behavior throughout the evening. "Mr. Kingston," David Chen asked during cross-examination, Do you recall telling Ms. Collins to go back to the kitchen where she belonged? And referring to restaurant staff as people who should know their proper place? Brad's attempts to minimize or justify his comments only served to reinforce the defense argument that he had systematically created the conditions that led to violence. His obvious sense of entitlement and continued dismissive attitude toward service workers undermined his portrayal as an innocent victim of unprovoked assault. The jury deliberated for 2 days before reaching a verdict that surprised legal observers and established important precedents about self-defense rights and the responsibilities of individuals with specialized training. They found Emma Collins guilty of assault but rejected the prosecution's argument for aggravated charges, recognizing that the confrontation had been provoked by Brad Kingston's behavior and that Emma's response, while excessive, had been triggered by legitimate concerns about physical threat. The judge's sentencing reflected the complex nature of the case and the unique circumstances that had led to the confrontation. Emma received 18 months in county jail with the possibility of early release for good behavior, along with community service requirements that would allow her to use her martial arts expertise in constructive ways. Ms. Collins, Judge Patricia Rodriguez said during sentencing, "You possess skills that most people can barely comprehend, and with those capabilities comes enhanced responsibility for restraint and judgment. However, the court recognizes that you were subjected to systematic harassment and eventual physical threat by someone who refused to accept reasonable boundaries. Your response was excessive, but understandable given the circumstances you faced." The sentence was lighter than what most legal experts had predicted for a case involving such serious injury caused by someone with Emma's background. The judge's comments suggested recognition that the confrontation had been essentially educational, teaching an important lesson to someone who had demonstrated complete disregard for basic human dignity. Emma Collins served 11 months of her sentence before being released for exemplary behavior and participation in jail-based programs that allowed her to teach self-defense techniques to female inmates. Her time in custody provided an opportunity for reflection and planning that would prove crucial to her eventual reintegration into society. During her incarceration, she received hundreds of letters from people across the country who had followed her case through media coverage. Many were from service industry workers who expressed gratitude for her willingness to stand up to the kind of customer abuse that they faced regularly. Others came from martial artists and former military personnel who understood the discipline required to maintain lethal skills while attempting to live peacefully among civilians. Ms. Collins, one letter from a restaurant server in Denver read, "I want you to know that every person who works in food service has dreamed of doing what you did to that arrogant customer. Thank you for showing that some people's money doesn't make them untouchable." The letters revealed that Emma had become a folk hero to people who dealt regularly with entitled, abusive customers but lacked the capabilities or legal protections to respond effectively. Her case had sparked conversations about workplace dignity, customer behavior, and the social dynamics that allowed wealth to translate into permission for cruelty. Emma also received correspondence from martial arts schools and women's self-defense programs requesting her involvement once her legal obligations were complete. Organizations across the country wanted to benefit from her expertise and her unique understanding of the intersection between professional fighting skills and civilian life. Jake Patterson visited her regularly throughout her incarceration, their friendship deepened by his growing understanding of what she had sacrificed in choosing to live quietly rather than trading on her reputation and capabilities. "I always wondered why someone with your skills was working prep in a restaurant kitchen," he said during one of their conversations. "Now I understand that you were trying to protect people from exactly what happened to Brad Kingston." Emma nodded, appreciating his insight into her motivations. "I learned that my abilities could be dangerous to people who didn't understand what they were dealing with. For 3 years, I successfully avoided situations where those abilities might be necessary." Unfortunately, some lessons can only be taught through direct experience. Do you think it was worth it? The legal trouble, the media attention, everything that happened. Emma considered the question carefully. Jake, Brad Kingston will never again treat service workers like personal property or assume that wealth gives him the right to humiliate other human beings. If permanent disability was the price required for that lesson, then it was a bargain compared to the cost of allowing him to continue that behavior indefinitely. Marcus Webb had maintained Emma's job at the Golden Anchor throughout her legal proceedings and incarceration, recognizing that losing her position would make her reintegration into civilian life significantly more difficult. When she was released, he offered her a promotion to assistant kitchen manager, along with increased responsibilities that would utilize her leadership capabilities and attention to detail. "Emma," he said when she returned to work, "what happened? That night was unfortunate, but it also revealed qualities about you that make you valuable beyond basic food preparation. You have the kind of presence and competence that could help train our entire kitchen staff." The offer represented an opportunity for Emma to begin rebuilding her life while using her skills in constructive ways. The Golden Anchor had actually benefited from the publicity surrounding her case, attracting customers who were curious to visit the restaurant where the legendary confrontation had occurred. Emma's return to work was covered by local media, cementing her status as a regional celebrity. But Emma had discovered during her time in jail that her true calling lay not in restaurant management, but in teaching defensive skills to people who needed them most. The women's self-defense programs that had contacted her during her incarceration offered opportunities to use her expertise in ways that served larger purposes than personal income or career advancement. "Marcus, I appreciate the offer and the loyalty you've shown me throughout this entire situation," she said after considering his proposal. "But I've realized that my skills are needed elsewhere, in places where they can help people protect themselves, rather than just prepare food for paying customers." 3 months after her release from jail, Emma opened Collins Self-Defense Academy in a converted warehouse space near the Riverside Valley Marina. The location was symbolic, close enough to the Golden Anchor that people could see both buildings. From the waterfront, a reminder of the night when a quiet kitchen worker had revealed herself to be something far more dangerous and significant. The academy specialized in teaching practical defensive techniques to women, service industry workers, and others who faced regular interaction with potentially hostile individuals, but lacked the training or legal protections to defend themselves effectively. Emma's approach emphasized de-escalation and avoidance as primary strategies, with physical techniques reserved for situations where other options had been exhausted. "The goal," she explained to her first class of students, "is never to hurt anyone. The goal is to create enough space and time to escape from dangerous situations. Everything I teach you is designed to help you go home safely to your families, not to turn you into fighters looking for confrontation." Her reputation attracted students from across the Pacific Northwest, people who wanted to learn from someone who had proven her techniques in real-world situations rather than just competition venues. The Academy's enrollment grew steadily as word spread about Emma's unique combination of technical expertise and practical wisdom. Jake Patterson became her first assistant instructor, his boxing background complementing her broader martial arts knowledge. Their friendship had evolved into a professional partnership that allowed the Academy to offer comprehensive training programs covering everything from basic awareness to advanced defensive techniques. "Emma," he said during one of their planning sessions, "you've created something here that goes way beyond just teaching people how to fight. You're teaching them how to recognize their own worth and demand respect from people who would rather treat them like property." Emma appreciated his understanding of what she was trying to accomplish. The Academy was more than a martial arts school. It was a place where people could learn to value themselves enough to resist mistreatment, and developed the confidence to set boundaries with individuals who preferred victims to equals. Detective Rachel Barnes became a regular visitor to the academy, initially investigating reports of potential vigilante training, but eventually recognizing the legitimate value of Emma's programs. Her law enforcement experience had shown her the inadequacy of police response to many situations that required immediate defensive action by potential victims. "Ms. Collins," she said during one of her visits, "I have to admit that what you're doing here fills a gap that traditional law enforcement can't address. We can't be everywhere people need protection, and we can't prevent situations like what happened to you at the restaurant. Teaching people to protect themselves is probably more effective than anything the police department can provide." The conversation led to a formal partnership between the academy and local law enforcement, with Emma providing specialized training to officers while receiving official recognition for her contribution to community safety. The arrangement legitimized her work while ensuring that her methods remained within legal boundaries. 2 years after the incident at the Golden Anchor, Emma Collins had transformed from a hiding kitchen worker into a respected community leader whose expertise was sought by law enforcement, social service organizations, and educational institutions throughout the region. Her academy had trained hundreds of students, and her techniques had been successfully used by graduates to escape dangerous situations, ranging from workplace harassment to attempted assault. Brad Kingston had undergone multiple surgeries attempting to repair the damage to his knee, but medical experts agreed that he would never regain full mobility or live without chronic pain. The injury had ended his career in investment banking, where extensive travel and client meetings had been essential to his success. He had been forced to accept disability payments and adjust to life with permanent limitations that served as daily reminders of his encounter with Emma Collins. His attempts to sue Emma for financial compensation had been unsuccessful, with courts ruling that his own behavior had precipitated the confrontation and that his injuries, while serious, were the direct result of his decision to escalate verbal harassment into physical threat. The legal precedent established by Emma's case had made it significantly more difficult for individuals to claim victim status when their own conduct had created dangerous situations. Emma occasionally encountered Brad around Riverside Valley, usually in medical settings where he was receiving ongoing treatment for his disability. Their interactions were brief and awkward, marked by his obvious resentment and her calm professionalism. She felt no satisfaction in seeing his diminished condition, but neither did she regret the lesson that had proven so expensive for him to learn. "Mr. Kingston," she said during one chance encounter at a physical therapy clinic where she was visiting an academy student recovering from a car accident, "I hope your recovery is progressing well." Brad's response was bitter and predictable. "Recovery? You destroyed my leg, my career, my entire life. I hope you're satisfied with what you accomplished." Emma studied his face, recognizing the same arrogance and sense of entitlement that had characterized their original confrontation. The experience had cost him his mobility and professional standing, but it apparently hadn't taught him the fundamental lesson about treating other people with basic respect and dignity. "Mr. Kingston, I'm sorry that you're still suffering from the injuries you sustained. However, I notice that you're still speaking to me with the same disrespect that led to our original confrontation. Perhaps you need additional educational experiences before you fully understand the lessons that situation was designed to teach." The comment was delivered with the same calm professionalism that had characterized her behavior throughout their legal proceedings, but it carried an unmistakable implication that further instruction remained available if necessary. Brad's expression shifted from anger to something approaching fear as he remembered exactly what kind of educational experiences Emma Collins was capable of providing. He left the clinic without further comment, his departure marking what would prove to be their final interaction. Emma had no interest in continuing to punish him for past behavior, but neither would she tolerate any resumption of the kind of treatment that had originally brought them into conflict. Emma Collins had spent 3 years learning to be invisible, trying to hide exceptional capabilities behind the comfortable anonymity of kitchen work and routine, civilian life. Her encounter with Brad Kingston had shattered that disguise permanently, forcing her to acknowledge that some skills were too valuable to waste on comfortable hiding. The academy she had built from the aftermath of that confrontation served hundreds of students who needed the knowledge and confidence that only someone with her background could provide. Former victims learned to recognize their own worth and develop the capabilities necessary to protect themselves from predators who preferred easy targets to equal opponents. Her reputation had evolved from local legend to regional authority on personal protection and self-defense training. Law enforcement agencies consulted her about tactics and training methods. Social service organizations referred clients who needed specialized help developing confidence and defensive capabilities. Educational institutions invited her to speak about violence prevention and personal safety. But the most important aspect of her transformation was personal rather than professional. For the first time since her discharge from professional fighting, Emma Collins was living honestly about who she was and what she could accomplish. She no longer needed to pretend that her hands were only capable of chopping vegetables or that her knowledge extended no further than basic food service. The woman who had once been known as the silencer had found her voice again, using it to teach others that they didn't have to accept mistreatment from people who confused wealth with worthiness or position with permission to be cruel. Some lessons could only be learned through experience, and Emma Collins had proven herself uniquely qualified to provide those experiences when traditional education proved insufficient. The kitchen where she had spent 3 years hiding her true capabilities remained empty, her carefully constructed anonymity replaced by purposeful visibility that served something larger than personal comfort or safety. She had learned that legends weren't always defined by what they had accomplished in the past, but by what they continued to contribute in the present. Emma Collins was no longer hiding from who she was or what she could do. She was using every skill she had learned, every lesson she had been taught, and every capability she had developed to help others discover their own strength and worth. The ghost had stepped fully into the light, and the world was a safer place for people who needed protection from those who confused money with the right to be monsters. Some people were born to serve, as Brad Kingston had insisted during their confrontation. But others were born to teach, and Emma Collins had finally found her proper place in the world, standing between predators and their preferred victims, providing education to anyone who needed to learn the difference between wealth and worth, between position and permission, between what people assumed about others and what those people were actually capable of accomplishing. The lesson that had cost Brad Kingston his mobility and career had been expensive, but it was also complete and permanent. He would never again make the mistake of assuming that quiet people were weak people, or that service workers existed solely for his entertainment and abuse. And throughout Riverside Valley, in restaurants and retail stores and every other place where people with money encountered people without it, Brad Kingston's story served as a cautionary tale about the wisdom of treating everyone with basic human dignity, regardless of their current occupation or apparent social position. Sometimes the most dangerous person in any room was the one who looked like they belonged somewhere else entirely. And sometimes the most expensive education was the kind that could only be provided through direct, personal experience of consequences. That lasted a lifetime. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.